Dr. Dina Dye here with Foundations in Torah. Welcome to this week's Torah portion, Shoftim, out of Deuteronomy. In particular, we're going to look at Deuteronomy 17 and the concept of the king. But of course, we're coming to the conclusion of another year, leading us up to Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, the day of the awakening blast, also signifies many different themes, but in particular, the coronation of the king. So we're going to talk a little bit about the enthronement, in particular, King Solomon. And as we begin this portion, it talks about appointing judges and officers for all your gates. So again, think of the context of the temple, that there were many gates, of course, as you entered in. We can compare that with the tabernacle or the garden. There's always gates, entry points. And so this is the place where judges sat, and this is where the judges and the officers served the king. Again, like the garden, think about the garden and the opening there. We have the two cherubim, or the cherubim. They stood there as guards. And in the temple, we always had Levites who stood as guard at the entry places. And those places are the important places to protect the sphere from an enemy coming in, because the enemy would come in through the gate. So these are, and gates in those days weren't little small thresholds of 3 inches. These are giant gates. Can be 30, 40, 50, 60 feet. So there was business that was conducted in the gate. Again, the protection came at the place of the gate. The place of the gate was where a death sentence took place. So this particular portion talks about there needed to be 2 or 3 witnesses for those who transgressed the covenant. Of course, covenants were made at the gates. And the people would be judged if they were serving other gods, worshiping them, and not the king that God had appointed. Of course, ultimately, God is our king, and he is the one they were supposed to worship. But again, the temple, the pattern of the tabernacle, the garden, all of this is palace language, whereby the Holy of Holies would be the throne. So it's all about the king being seated on the throne and his enthronement. Now, the king's responsibility was to judge the people. And he was the one who would judge the people righteously, using righteous judgment. So now we come up to Rosh Hashanah. It is, of course, the day of judgment. And that is when the king passes judgment on all the people of the world. So this is definitely connected to the context of the Holy of Holies, when the king sat and was enthroned and judged the people. Now, there are various things that are inserted in. This is talking about not distorting judgment or justice, not showing favoritism. The king had to rule with right judgment. And that was so that they could live in the land and inherit the land that God was giving them. The land also signified the sphere, the sacred sphere. So the temple and the land became associated one with another. The garden, the land, again, all the same. The land represented, if you will, the throne of God. Now, in particular, it was in the midst of the land, as we have in the midst of the garden or in the midst of the cosmos. So in the midst of the temple, again, we have the Holy of Holies, the place from which the king would rule and reign. So all of this is describing the role of the king. Now, it tells us that when they entered the land, of course, they wanted to be like the other nations. And so what God was saying, you must appoint as king the one God chooses for you. The right way to go would have been to have God seated on the throne, dwelling in his holy place, ruling and reigning from that place. But of course, they wanted to be like everyone else. They wanted a physical king sitting on the throne who would rule over them. And there were a number of conditions, and it's quite interesting as we go through these. So one of them is they had to appoint a kingsman, a member of their community. They were forbidden to have a foreigner rule over them. They were not to acquire many horses, and they were not to actually return to Egypt for more horses. Now, these are the requirements of the king. The king was not to acquire many wives, so that his heart would turn away from God. He was not to acquire excessive amounts of gold and silver. And more significantly, he was to write a copy of the Torah in a scroll given to him by one of the Kohanim or the Leviim. He was to read it every day as long as he lived. And in that way, he would learn to fear God, and he would rule righteously and with justice. And he was never to think of himself as better than his other kinsmen. So when you read this, you can't help but think of Solomon, because he violated most of these conditions. So he comes to mind, and we think, Solomon is this sort of great king that ruled over a unified Israel. And yet we see all his foibles, his failures as a man. And that's significant because where the places where he failed, Yeshua came and brought peace and restored justice and walked perfectly according to the commandments of God. So we know Solomon began to build, in the 4th year of his reign, he began to build the temple. You can read this in 1 Kings 6. Actually, 6 and 7 is a good place to go to read this whole backdrop here. We know it took 7 years to build, and that he dedicated the temple at Sukkot over the period of 2 sets of 7 days. And it's probably around 950 BCE that the temple was actually consecrated. And so then the glory of God filled the house. The presence of God entered, moved in, if you will, into the place of the Holy of Holies, and his presence was there. So when we go into 1 Chronicles 29 in particular, we have the whole king-making ritual here. And this is speaking of the enthronement of Solomon. Again, this can correspond to Rosh Hashanah. That is when the kings of Judah would have had their enthronement, their coronation. So he was then sitting on the throne, just like God would sit on the throne in the Holy of Holies, if you will. And essentially, he was sitting on his father's throne, who was, of course, King David. We have the same picture in Psalm 110, another good one to read, because this sets the context and the picture of the divine king. So we know that David wrote this psalm, and it seems like the psalm, as he wrote it, was a psalm for his son's enthronement. And so now we have a little bit of a pattern here of the father and the son, the enthronement ritual, and the son sitting on the throne of the father. And of course, in that, I believe it's First Chronicles 29:22b. If you read that over, it talks about how they made Solomon the son of David the king, and it inserts in there for a second time, and they anointed him, and the hymn, it's questionable whether that's actually in the original Hebrew, but he was anointed before the Lord to be their leader, their ruler, and Zadok to be the priest. So Solomon is sitting on the throne of the Lord as king now instead of David, his father, and in that he prospered, and all of Israel prospered as well. So we have 2 accounts of Solomon building the temple, going back to that, because the temple was for the purpose. It was a palace. It was for the place, the throne of the king. That was the reason it was built. So again, 1 Kings 6 and 7, 2 Chronicles 2 through 5, you can read the same account. So when Solomon was made king, he sat on the throne as though he was the Lord and king. And at that point, all the assembly blessed him and worshipped him as king, saying, "Long live the king," etc., etc. It was as though at his enthronement, he was no longer the human king anymore, but he became divine. So in the ancient world, that's the case. When the human king was enthroned, he now was the son of the former king, and he became divine, or in the nature of the former king as well. As again, at his enthronement, becoming as though he became Lord and King, if you will, not realistically, but the sense was, or the meaning was, that the adoption of the king was adopted, if you will, as the divine son. So this sense of divinity came at the enthronement. Interestingly enough, every king of Judah was called the Son of God. So now we can go back to the garden. The first throne sanctuary in the midst of the garden was the throne for our God, the king, and his son would have been Adam. Adam is basically the son of the Most High God. Even his name, Adam, the is the Aleph. It kind of means the blood of God, so that the bloodline, if you will, of the king was passed to Adam, who was the first king, who was also the first high priest, and again, Son of God, because all kings were called Son of God. And I think this is a similar pattern that we have here in Solomon. So in the flesh, in the natural, as a man, Solomon blew it. But we are being instructed here in the way of the kingship and how the king took the throne, and how, as the Son of God, he became divine, is what we see in the sort of supernatural realm, or the realm outside of time. Solomon was king in the physical realm, but we're being shown something in the world outside of time at the very same time. If you read in Psalm 2:7, it says that you are my son, today I have begotten you. And that is the idea of him changing form, if you will, from a man to the one who is divine. This term begot or birth is terminology for the divine son, and it was associated with resurrection. So we see it perfectly played out with Yeshua, divine son who was resurrected and who was son of God, son of the king who became divine. The language is used with all the kings, even though they're just men. So we know Solomon was not resurrected, but we know that Yeshua, the Messiah, was. Again, enthronement is very much birthing language. So the human, if you will, the human man had become, in a sense, the high priest, because God or Yahweh was represented in the temple by the high priest. So we have a high priest in heaven, we have a high priest on earth. Remember, we have two temples, the one that functioned outside of time, the one that functioned inside time. And so Solomon, of course, represented the world inside of time, and there wasn't a different high priest we see in Zadok, which is why those two anointings with king and priest might be occurring at the same time. So Yahweh himself represented the high priest of heaven, symbolically, of course, but in the world outside of time, that was quite different. So angels in the world outside of time, in the heavenly realms, in the temple, in heaven, if you will, were priests. On earth, they were priests. In heaven, they were angels. They had the same function. They did the same thing. They performed the services and ceremonies, etc., etc. So the high priest then, of course, was chief of the priests on earth, where we have the chief of the angels in heaven. It's the same language. It's just that's the way they used to describe it. The otherworldly language, that's the way it's described. The high priest, of course, was the only one who could enter into the Holy of Holies. That is the throne room. And so the high priest would enter in there. It's interesting that we see Yeshua never entered the Holy of Holies on earth. Again, he was a man, but he was raised up in the heavenly realms to sit on the throne in the Holy of Holies there, and he became divine, if you will, Son of God. The high priest was the link between the two worlds, the invisible and the visible world. Interesting quote from Philo, and he says, the high priest is not a man, but a divine logos. His father being God, who is likewise father of all, and his mother, wisdom, through whom the universe came into existence. Now, I have a lot of this material in my book, The Temple Revealed in Creation, A Portrait of the Family, goes into this whole concept of the mother wisdom and the father God in great detail. So I'm not going to really talk about it here. But since Solomon is just a man, he is not raised from the dead. And now we see as a man he violates all the things that he's not supposed to in Deuteronomy 17. So, of course, he gathered chariots and horsemen, 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen. He went back to Egypt to get more. He married 1,000 wives, wives and concubines, and brought into his harem strange women. Of course, we had the daughter of Pharaoh, we had Moabites, we had Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, etc. And so now you think about how Solomon raised his own son. His son Rehoboam is the one who divides the kingdom between Israel and Judah. And so again, we think about Adam, who was the king, the high priest. By his sin and his violation, he ends up raising up his son Cain, who murdered his other son Abel. In the end, the idea of the king of Israel exists to bring and achieve sovereignty over the land always representing the temple. And this sovereignty had two attributes, peace and the holy temple, or the place of the throne of God. So even Solomon's name means peace, but of course he didn't bring that kind of peace. Only Messiah could. But this is the pattern. The pattern that Solomon shows us is the pattern that Yeshua would bring to the earthly realm and to the heavenly realms. Solomon wasn't even able to achieve it in the earthly realm. So God's sovereignty over creation representing the temple, and the people coming together to worship their God in his house as he sits on the throne as King of Kings. And the idea was for them to build him a sanctuary so that he may dwell among you and among us. And ultimately, his sovereignty is speaking of him dwelling in our midst. And that is the goal as we come towards Rosh Hashanah, to see God sitting on his throne in the Holy of Holies, if you will, that is the world outside of time, ruling and reigning and judging the nations and restoring the people. So thanks for joining me this week. We'll see you next time. Shalom.